Exposure is a complex issue in post-processing photographs. It's more than merely making sure that the image isn't too bright or too dark. It also touches on tonality and color. The histogram isn't really a tool for controlling those attributes so much as it is a tool for visualizing what is going on at the pixel levels of the photograph. And in ACDSee, the histogram is a full-featured tool that will allow you to monitor exactly what is happening to your photo when you make changes to various controls. The histogram is long-established technology, and the differences between the ACDSee histogram, which I use in this video, and the histograms of other software are mostly cosmetic in nature. I'm confident you can apply what you learn here to your own favorite software. So let's begin. The histogram is a reflection of all the changes you make to a given photo. There are 3 color channels displayed as a line chart on the XY axis. The colors are the 3 primary colors that make up all the other colors in photography, that is red, green, and blue. There is a 4th channel that represents luminance, or the relative brightness of the 3 primary colors combined. On the horizontal, or x-axis, the left portion of the histogram describes graphically how much of the photo is in the shadows, while the right portion of the histogram describes graphically how much of the photo is in the highlights. And you guessed it, the center portion of the histogram describes graphically how much of the photo lies within the midtones. The Y, or vertical axis of the graph, represents the number of pixels involved. If the curve is very high at a given point on the chart, that means that a lot of the total number of pixels on the photo are involved in creating the color and/or the relative intensity of the color or the brightness in the highlights and the shadows and the midtones. The total number of pixels found in your photo depends on the number of pixels your camera captures. You don't get any more pixels than that. So, the histogram is a graphical chart of how those pixels are distributed. Luckily, we have some limited ability to redistribute those pixels. As an example, we obviously can't move a pixel from the darkest shadows on the left all the way to the highlights on the right. But if we have properly exposed that photograph, we should be able to shift at least some of those pixels involved with the shadows and the darker colors a bit to the right, and thereby changing the visual nature of the photo. That is what the exposure, color, and tonality controls do. They help you redistribute those pixels to a more pleasing configuration, and by studying how the histogram changes as we adjust those controls, we can learn a lot about our photography, both at how we take pictures and in how we process those pictures. Now let's discuss how some of those controls affect the histogram. We are now ready to demonstrate not only how changing the controls can alter the histogram, but in understanding what the straight out of camera histogram means for your ability to alter and edit a given photo. We will use this most boring of sample photos. It isn't great art, but it has all the qualities I need to illustrate the points I'm about to make. On the whole, it's a reasonably well exposed and focused raw photo. Let's examine the histogram as it came out of the camera and was interpreted by ACDSee. Note that the curve starts a little way in from the very darkest possible shadows and ends a little way from the brightest highlights. Actually, there are tiny bits of the curve at the extreme ends, but they are so small that they are visually irrelevant. However, the fact that we can see the curve at the highlights end tells us that there are some amounts of detail in the brightest highlights, and that those highlights won't appear completely blown in the photo. Note that the color channels, with minor variations, pretty much stay in sync with each other. That would indicate that the photo has a relatively small number of colors in it. And if we look at the photo, it is mostly brown, green, shades of gray, and with a blue sky peeking through. Also note that the dark ends of the curve start to curve upwards rapidly and come to a peak roughly at a place that I would describe as the darkest point of the midtones. Then the curve drops rapidly and only peaks again at the place I would describe as the brightest point of the midtones. This tells me that there isn't a lot of the midtones in the photo, and the few that there are tend to be at the darker and the brighter ends of the midtone area. After that, the curve drops rapidly. Note that the three color channels in the highlights area aren't as in sync with each other as they were. That indicates that what color variation there is in the photo is mostly in the highlights. Now let's change some of the controls and see how that alters the histogram. As I said earlier, the controls in your editor or raw developer actually change the live histogram and help you understand what your changes actually do to the photo. Let's first look at the exposure control. We all know that the exposure slider lightens and darkens a photo, but what does that look like in a histogram? Note that when you move the exposure slider to the left, the entire curve is pushed to the left. And when you move the slider to the right, the entire curve moves to the right. Note that the spike on the far right that develops, what do you think that means? Well, if you said it means you have lost detail in the highlights, you would be correct. While you might suspect that you have lost highlight detail from looking at the photo, the histogram offers incontrovertible proof that as long as that spike exists, there is highlight detail lost to you. Well then, if the exposure control slides the curve to the left or the right, how does the contrast control change the histogram? What it does is compress or expand the curve either towards the very center of the histogram or towards the edges. Note that as I move the slider, the anchor or the starting points for the highlights and the shadows remain fixed. So the points where we lose all detail in the shadows and the highlights don't really change, though it can seem to change if we have also altered the exposure and contrast at the same time. But you say, what if I want the points at which we lose detail in the shadows and the highlights to change? In that case, we want to examine the tone curve control. The tone curve control will eventually get its own tutorial all to itself, but for now, we will discuss it in relationship to its major effects on the histogram. Many people think of the curves tool as an alternative contrast slider, and they aren't entirely wrong. If you create a traditional S curve, you can create the same sort of contrast adjustment that the contrast slider can perform. The advantage is it gives significantly more control over the predetermined curve algorithm of the contrast slider. If you want to change the point at which you lose shadow detail, you can slide that little black triangle to the right. If you want to change the point at which you lose highlight detail, you can slide the little right triangle to the left. But what, you ask, is that little gray triangle in the middle? Yep. It controls the midtones, and it helps moderate the brightness. When you slide it to the left or the right, note how the curve in the histogram moves left or right in a manner similar to that of the exposure control. I tend to set the exposure and the contrast sliders first, and then tweak the tonality and brightness with the tone curves if they need it. Other people use the tone curve almost exclusively. There are no wrong answers, really. It's the results that count. I'm not going to go any further with the other tools. I think I've given you enough basic information to understand the histogram and how the controls affect it and what the changes to the histogram means. If you want more information, look up my regular blog at the location listed on the screen. It's full of post-processing information that uses either ACDSee products or Corel Paint Shop Pro as the example software. I'm Glen Barrington, and thanks for watching.